Blackstone Audio presents Beckett in 90 Minutes by Paul Strathern. Introduction. In 1946, Beckett found himself back in Ireland, staying with his disapproving mother. He had left Paris because he did not have enough money to continue living in his chosen city. He was now approaching 40, and forced to confront the prospect of his utter failure. All the hopes of his brilliant youth had come to nothing. Apart from a few scattered pieces, mostly in small magazines, he had published just one novel. This had passed virtually unnoticed by the reading public, the bulk of its copies being remaindered. During the war he had written another novel, and had at last felt that he was getting somewhere. But this novel had recently been turned down by his publishers, who had reacted to it with considerable bewilderment, finding it wild and unintelligible. In their opinion, it stood no chance whatsoever of publication. Though deeply wounded by this rejection, Beckett too was dissatisfied with his work. He disagreed with his publisher's rejection, but he felt a nagging suspicion that he was somehow not on the right track. Something was missing. Something eluded him, preventing him from achieving all of which he felt he was capable. The great promise he had shown, the promise that had been recognized by no less than James Joyce himself, remained unfulfilled. Beckett was at a loss over what to do, and he began drinking heavily in the bars of Dublin. At night he would wander the streets in a bemused state, lost in his thoughts. One night he found himself standing at the end of the stone pier of Dunleary Harbour. Years later he would recall this moment in an earlier version of his play Krapp's Last Tape, where Krapp's recorded voice disjointedly relates, "Intellectually, a year of profound gloom and indigence until that memorable night in March, at the end of the pier, in the howling wind, never to be forgotten, when suddenly I saw the whole thing, the turning point at last. This, I imagine, is what I have chiefly to set down this evening against the day when my work will be done, and perhaps no place left in my memory, and no thankfulness for the miracle for the fire it set alight. What I saw then was that the assumption I had been going on all my life, namely, clear to me at last that the dark I have been fighting off all this time is in reality my most unshatterable association till my dying day of story and night with the light of understanding and—" Beckett had realized that he had been looking in the wrong place, in the wrong direction. Instead of trying to come to terms with the world around him, he should have been focusing on the inner world, on the dark he had struggled to keep under. Joyce had gone as far as it was possible to go, in the direction of knowing more, being in control of one's material. But Beckett realized that my own way was in impoverishment, in lack of knowledge, and in taking away, in subtracting rather than adding. His subject matter was not the great intellectual achievements of the human condition, but its hopelessness and despair, the grim, farcical element of its inescapable failure, all the things that he himself knew so well. From this point on, Beckett would no longer care whether what he wrote appeared wild and unintelligible. He would express the discontentedness of his own inner voice, the voice that had accompanied him through the long voyage of his life so far. Beckett's Life and Works. Samuel Beckett was born on Good Friday, April 13th, 1906, in Foxrock, a middle-class suburb between the Wicklow Mountains and the Irish Sea south of Dublin. His family was descended from Huguenots, the Protestants who were forced to flee Catholic persecution in France during the late 18th century. But the Becketts had long since lost any awareness of themselves as anything other than Irish. The family was part of the prosperous Protestant minority in Ireland, which at the time was still part of Great Britain. There is little evidence of creative inclination among Beckett's predecessors, with the possible exception of his paternal grandmother Fanny, whose unfulfilled sensitivity drove her to drink. According to family mythology, she would lock herself in her room for days on end. At other times she sported a parrot on her shoulder, which would screech with jealous rage when anyone kissed Fanny. William Beckett, the writer's father, was a jovial Philistine who made a considerable fortune as a building contractor and property speculator. Beckett retained affectionate memories of his father, with whom he would go on long walks over the barren, treeless countryside of the nearby Wicklow Mountains. But the dominant parent in Beckett's life was his mother, May, a tall, long-faced, difficult woman descended from an impecunious landowning family. All who met her agreed that there was something odd about her, something that didn't quite fit in with the role of conventional suburban life. She suffered from insomnia, and had the carpets removed from the upstairs floors so that she could hear the footfall of any approaching ghost. Despite this, there was little overtly eccentric about her apart from her willfulness. This appears to have met its match in her second son, Samuel. Beckett's older brother Frank took after his father, but it soon became clear that Sam was psychologically much more complex, a condition he appeared to find as irksome as everyone else. As a result, he was a solitary child, both by circumstance and inclination. Surprisingly, the reserved young Beckett did well at school, being both intellectually gifted and accomplished at sports, despite his bad eyesight. From an early age he had been forced to wear round, steel-rimmed spectacles, which he would continue to wear all his life. In 1920, at the age of 14, he became a boarder at Portora Royal School, a Protestant private school in the province of Ulster, which was to become Northern Ireland. In 1922, Ireland gained independence, with Northern Ireland electing to remain part of Britain. There followed a civil war in the Irish Free State between the two Catholic factions. The schoolboy Beckett would have been largely insulated from all this, but would certainly have been aware of the upheavals that were taking place. It is difficult to judge the precise effect of this traumatic historical background. It would certainly leave a profound mark upon his Protestant Irish contemporary, the painter Francis Bacon. The newly independent Ireland was a troubled, desperately poor country, heavily dominated by the Catholic Church, which forbade contraception. As a result, large families contributed further to the poverty of the majority Catholic population. Out of ambition or necessity, many emigrated to Britain and America, leaving saddened, abandoned families behind. Although Beckett never lived in poverty in his homeland, the hopeless, downtrodden characters who inhabit much of his later fiction would have been recognizable on any street in Dublin, even if the background Beckett gave them was often more reminiscent of the Wicklow Mountains. Beckett's unaccommodated man may have had a distant literary ancestor in the poor, bare, forked animal seen by Shakespeare's King Lear on the blasted heath. But the characters in Beckett's work also mirrored real people, whose hopeless temperament and grim humour had been forged by real despair. At the age of 17, Beckett went to Trinity College, Dublin, where he studied modern languages, English, French, and Italian. Here he quickly acquired the seemingly obligatory penchant for vast quantities of Guinness and an equally unquenchable thirst for literature and philosophy. In his final 4th year, he won a place on the university cricket team, which went on a short summer tour playing against English counties. These matches are recorded in Wisden, the cricketer's Bible, making him the only Nobel Prize winner to appear in its august pages. In his final exams, Beckett won the gold medal as the top scholar. He emerged from university an awkward young man who, in that scornful but telling Dublin phrase, was educated beyond his intelligence. Like his philosophical hero Descartes, he found it difficult to rise from his bed before noon. This made him particularly unsuited to the employment he now gained as a schoolmaster at Campbell College, Belfast, a middle-class Ulster institution similar to Portora. As with many a brilliant student, he quickly acquired a distaste for the amiable dullards who formed the staff and pupils. To them he appeared a conceited and arrogant young man. The final straw came when he was summoned yet again to appear before the exasperated headmaster, who forcefully reminded him that the pupils he treated with such contempt were, in fact, the cream of Ulster. "Yes," replied Beckett, "rich and thick." He found himself on the next train to Dublin. The only surprise was that he had lasted as long as 2 terms. Fortunately, his linguistic success at Trinity College enabled him to qualify for an exchange post as lecteur at the prestigious French École Normale Supérieure. This would allow him to live for 2 years in Paris. Nothing could have suited Beckett better. Within months he had taken up residence in a small room on the left bank and was wearing a beret, his fingers browned with nicotine stains from strong Gaulois tobacco, drinking. In their opinion, it stood no chance whatsoever of publication. Though deeply wounded by this rejection, Beckett, too, was dissatisfied with his work. He disagreed with his publisher's rejection, but he felt a nagging suspicion that he was somehow not on the right track. Something was missing, something to continue living in his chosen city. He was now approaching 40, and forced to confront the prospect of his utter failure. All the hopes of his brilliant youth had come to nothing. Apart from a few scattered pieces, mostly in small magazines, he had published just one novel. This had passed virtually unnoticed, eluded him, preventing him from achieving all of which he felt he was capable. The great promise he had shown, the promise that had been recognized by no less than James Joyce himself, remained unfulfilled. Beckett was at a loss over what to do, and he began drinking heavily in the bars of Dublin, by the reading public, the bulk of its copies being remaindered. During the war he had written another novel, and had at last felt that he was getting somewhere. But this novel had recently been turned down by his publishers, who had reacted to it with considerable bewilderment, finding it wild and unintelligible. Blackstone Audio presents Beckett in 90 Minutes by Paul Strathern. Introduction. In 1946 Beckett found himself back in Ireland, staying with his disapproving mother. He had left Paris because he did not have enough money